Chapter 1. There is a place in the north of Spain where neither the Romans nor the Moors ever arrived, and if Mrs. Berta de Rondallego, owner of this green and silent hideout, knew a little more about history, she would swear that Agrippa, nor Augusto, nor Musa, nor Tarik had ever put the daring plant on the ground, always soft with thick fresh grass, juicy, dark, velvety and shiny, from that corner of hers, all hers, deaf, like her, to the rumors of the world, packed in thick greens of infinite trees and lush meadows, as she is in yellow flannel, because of his ailments. Dona Berta's corner of leaves and herbs belongs to the parish of Pi del Oro, Council of Carreño, judicial district of Gijón, and within the parish the neighborhood of Dona Berta is distinguished with the name of Zaernan, and within the neighborhood the leafy hollow is called Susacasa, in the middle of which there is a large meadow that has the name Aran. At the northwest end of the meadow runs a stream fringed by tall poplars, birches, and conical dark-leaved smokers, which begins to spiral around the trunk from the ground, stumbling over grass and flowers at the water's edge. The stream does not have a name there, nor does it deserve it, not even water for baptism, but the geographical vanity of the owners of Susacasa called it the river for centuries, and the residents of other places in the same neighborhood, out of contempt for the lordship of Rondallego, call that river the Regato, and humiliate it as much as they can, keeping unscathed deceitful easements that cross the current of the fugitive crystalline guest of the Aran and the Losa, and they cross it, oh! Sarcasm, without the need for bridges, no longer Roman, since it has been said that the Romans did not walk there, not even with bridges that were hollow trunks and half-rotten, of greenery revived in contact with the humid earth of the shores. Dona Berta complains bitterly about these tyrannical servitudes, of unknown and suspicious origin, democratic victories sanctioned by time, not so much because they humiliate the river, crossing it without a bridge, with nothing more than a large stone in the middle of the channel, an islet of silica, worn by the secular rubbing of bare feet and studded shoes, how much because they wither the most luxuriant country flowers and kill, when sprouting, the freshest grass of the fertile Aran. Pointing out its immaculate greenery with scars that cross it like bands on a chest, kicked scars. But leaving these sadnesses for later, I will continue saying that beyond and above, because here the slope begins, beyond the river that jumps without bridges or fords, is the Losa, generic name of the corn meadows that gather such and such conditions, which there is no reason to specify now. This is that when the reeds grow, and their leaves, flexible spears, are already swinging on the stem, inclined in a graceful curve, the sea-green grass seems stirred by the breezes. Well, on the other shore of that sea is the palace, a white house, not very large, ancestral to the Rondallegos, and it and its corral, quintana, and its dependencies, which are chapel, attached to the palace, winery, today converted haystack, chestnut granary with stone feet, pigalos, and a square white dovecot, all together, plus a cabin with farmhouse honors, which are on the same slope of the hill on which the palace rests, 30 steps from it. All that, I say, is called Posadorio. Chapter 2. Dona Berta and Sabellona live alone in the palace. They and the cat, which, like the Aran stream, has no name because it is unique, the cat, its gender. The landlord lives in the farmhouse, an old man, deaf like Dona Berta, with an almost imbecile daughter who, nevertheless, helps him in his chores like a strong hustler, and a servant, always uncouth, who every few days is another, because the deaf old man is quick-tempered, and dismisses his people for minor offenses. The hunt takes her halfway. Even whole would be worth very little, the land is so green, so fresh, it is not first class, it produces almost nothing. Dona Berta is poor, but clean, and the dignity of her almost imaginary domain consists in part in that neatness that is born from the soul. Dona Berta mixes and confuses within herself the idea of cleanliness and that of solitude, of isolation. With an Easter face, he makes the life of a Muni, who spins and washes clothes, a lot of white clothes, at home, and who also needs bread at home. It is needed every 5 or 6 days, and in this task, which calls for muscles stronger than their own and even those of the decadent sable, they are helped by the landlord's imbecile daughter, but spin, by themselves, the 2 old women, and take care of the laundry. As soon as the clothes come back from the river, they too. The upper garden is covered in white with the clothes hanging out to dry, and from the lean-to, which dominates everything, Dona Berta, deaf, silent, contemplates smiling, and giving thanks to God, the immaculate linen snow that she has at the feet, and the vegetables, which also seem washed, which serve as a frame for the clothes, extending through the forest of the house, and going down to the Losa and to the Aran. He seems to have been mowed down by a very fine hairdresser, and he almost has the air of a very shaven, very soapy, and very smelly person. Yes. It seems that they cut the grass with scissors and then soap and polish it. It is not completely flat, it is somewhat convex, it sinks mysteriously towards the flues, as it kisses the stream, and Dona Berta wished 1,000 times that she had the hands of a giant, of a day's worth of oxen each, to pass them over the Aran's back, neither more nor less than the cat. When he is in a bad mood, his eyes, contemplating the meadow, stop on the 2 paths that cross it, infamous stains, traces of the common people, of the damned scavengers who, out of envy, to grind, out of sheer malice, unnecessarily, without why or for what reason, maintain those public servitudes, dishonor of the Rondaligos. You don't go anywhere around here. In Zaernan the world ends. Hunters, armies, bandits, or criminal rogues never pass through Susakasa. Highways and railways stay far away. Even the neighboring roads pass by making respectful S's through the confines of that mansion embedded in grass and foliage. The creaking of the cars is always heard in the distance. Dona Berta doesn't even hear it, and the stubborn neighbors insist on disturbing so much peace, on staining those carpets with paths that seem like the rot of that freshness, paths where they leave the marks of their shoes and of the bare and dirty feet, as a rude seal of a usurpation of the absolute domain of the Rondaligos. Since when can the rabble pass through there? From time immemorial, witnesses have said 100 times. Lie. Dona Berta replies. Good were the Rondaligos of yesteryear to consent to the mangy withering the grass of the Aran with their pig heels. The Rondaligos. They did not want anything with anyone, they married each other, always with relatives, and did not mix blood or inheritance, they did not allow their lineage or meadows to be stained. She, Dona Berta, could not remember, it is clear, since when there were public paths that crossed her properties, but his heart gave him that all that must have been since the fall of the old regime, since there were liberals and things like that in the world. You don't go anywhere around here, this is the filibuster of the world, says Dona Berta, who has capricious geographical notions, a Homeric world map, so dreamed, and he thinks that the land ends in a point, and that the point is Zaernan, with Susakasa, the Aran meadow and Posadorio. Neither the Moors nor the Romans ever stepped on the grass of the Aran, she says one day and another day to her most faithful Sabalona, Isabel Grande, a servant of the Rondaligos since she was 10 years old, and through whom neither Moors nor Christians passed, for she is still as virgin as her mother bore her, and 70 winters ago. Neither the Moors nor the Romans. Dona Berta repeats at night, by the light of the oil lamp, next to the embers of the kitchen, whose hearth is on the ground, and Sabalona bows her head, as a sign of assent, with the same blind credulity with which, shortly after, on her knees, she repeats the acts of faith that her mistress is reciting in front of her. Neither Dona Berta nor Isabel know much more about Romans and Moors, apart from that negative news that they never passed through there. Perhaps they are not completely sure of the total ruin of the Western Empire or of the capture of Granada, which Dona Berta, in the end more versed in human sciences, confuses a little with the glorious war in Africa, and especially with the capture of Tetuan. In any case, they do not believe either one or the other to be so remote, as they are, in effect, the respective dominations of Agarenes and Romans, and ultimately, Romans and Moors come to represent for both, as a symbol, everything strange, everything distant, everything enemy, and so, when some strange interlocutor dared to tell them that the French never came to Susukasa either, nor was there any reason, they shrugged their shoulders, as if to say, well, all that means the Moors and Romans. And it is that this mania, hereditary in the Rondaligos, comes to Dona Berta from a tradition prior to the French invasion. Chapter 3. Oh, the liberals! Those had indeed reached Posidorio. Saballona's intact virginity has been spoken of before. The reader will have supposed that Dona Berta was a widow, or that her virtue was kept silent by ellipsis. Virtuous she was, but not a virgin, single yes. If Sable had seen herself in her mistress's case, she wouldn't be so whole. He understood it well, and for that reason he did not show any kind of moral superiority with respect to his mistress. It had been a misfortune, and it had paid dearly, misfortune and all. The Rondaligos were 4 brothers and a sister, Berta, orphaned as children. The eldership, Don Claudio, was the father. The cleanliness of the blood was among them a cult. All good, affable, like Berta, who was a smile walking, did charity work, from afar. They feared the common people, whom they loved as a brother in Christ, not in Rondalliego. His aristocratic solitude had as much of a smiling and resigned asceticism as of concern for lineage. The house's bookstore was a symbol of those tendencies. There was hardly more there than religious books, of collected and disappointed devotion, and books of coats of arms, everywhere the cross, and gold, and silver, and the gules of the shields stamped on vellum. A Rondalliego, 3 or 4 generations ago, had turned up dead in a wood, in La Mattiella, half a league from Posidorio, murdered by a neighbor, according to all suspicions. From then on the whole family watched their backs even when distributing alms. The greatest sin of the Rondaligos was to think ill of the common people whom they protected. For their part, the villains, perhaps one day dependent on Posidorio, collected the benefits with a gesture of servile humiliation, and overlapping mocked the decadence of that lordship, and showed, as long as they did not have to show their faces, their lack of respect in every possible way. For this, the new laws helped them a little, and the new politics especially. The symbol of public liberties, which they did not call that, of course, was for the residents of Pi del Oro the growing contempt for the Rondaligos, and the legal sanction that encouraged them to such contempt, through a contribution surcharge when distributing that of the council, forced and disproportionate labor in the sextiferias, abandonment of the rural police in the limits of Zaernan, and singularly of Susukasa, with another 100 hidden pinpricks, which were always at the expense of the city council, the law, new customs, the robe times. As for the dispossession of fruit, grass, firewood, etc., the law could no longer be directly blamed, which did not go as far as authorizing the robbery of the Rondaligos at night, but if not the law, its representatives, the mayor, the judge, the pedano, depending on the case, helped the neighborhood with their clumsiness and apathy, which never allowed them to run into the guilty. All this had been years ago. The good luck of the Rondaligos was the topographical elusiveness of their domain. If their character, that of the family, distanced them from the common people, the situation of their house also seemed like an escape from the world. The folds of the terrain and the thicknesses of the contour, and the fact that it was not a road to anywhere, were the cause of forgetting that, despite being contempt, was also the longed-for peace. Well, the Posidorio brothers said to themselves, the century, the village populace, despises us, and we him, in peace. However, whenever there was an opportunity, the Rondaligos exercised their charity in those surroundings. All the brothers remained single. They were cold, apathetic, although kind and smiling. The idol was clean honor, immaculate noble blood. In Berta, the sister, should be the sanctuary of that purity. But Berta, although she looked the same as her brothers, white, thick, sweet, calm in gestures, voice and gait, had tenderness inside that they did not. The second brother, something of a writer, brought home novels of the time, translated from French. They all read them. They left no trace on the men. In Berta they wreaked internal havoc. Romanticism, which in so many residents of the cities and towns was pure conversation, at best, a pretext for visucos, in Posidorio had a true priestess, although it reached there in echoes of echoes, in caked cereals. The brothers could never suspect the fire of ideality and pure sentimentality that they had in Posidorio. Not even after the misfortune did they give in to its cause. Thinking of romanticism, they attributed it to chance, to occasion, to treason, which they were also guilty of. Perhaps the worst thought came to thinking about concupiscence, which on Berta's part there was no. Only no one remembered innocent love, of a heart that melts at the contact of the fire that adores. Berta allowed herself to be deceived with all the truth of her soul. The story was very simple, like the one in his books. Everything happened the same. The captain arrived, a captain from the Cristinos. He came wounded, fugitive. He fell fainting in front of the gate of the villa. The dog barked. Berta arrived, saw the blood, the pallor, the uniform, and some sweet, blue eyes that asked for mercy, perhaps affection. She picked up the unfortunate man, hid him in the chapel of the house, abandoned, until she wondered if she would do well to notify her brothers, who were, like her, Carlists, and perhaps they would hand over their own to the fugitive, if hers passed through there. And they were looking for him. At last he was a liberal, a black. He thought well, and he was right. He revealed his secret, the brothers approved his conduct. The wounded man passed from the chapel's platform to the feathers of the best bed in the house. Everyone was silent. The faction, which passed by, did not know that such an enemy was so close, that it had been a scourge of the whites. 2 months Berta took care of the liberal with her own hands, solicitous, already in love from the first day. The brothers let her care and fall in love. They let her perform the services of a loving wife who has a dying husband, and they hoped that, naturally, the day the patient could leave Posidorio, all affection would end. Miss Rondallego would be a stranger to the Garrido captain, who cried every night with gratitude, while the brothers snored and the sister kept watch, not far from the bed, accompanied by an old woman and sable, then a healthy maiden. When the captain was able to get up and walk around the orchard, 2 of the brothers, then present in Posidorio, the other 2, the eldest and the last, had gone to the city for a few days, saw in the black an excellent friend, able to distract them from their resigned boredom. The sympathy between the Carlists and the liberal grew from day to day. The captain was expansive, tender, with a lively and strong imagination. He wanted, and he made himself loved, and more than that, he encouraged. The Rondelligo's lymphatics to innocent diversions, such as armed assaults, which he directed, without taking a very active part in them, games of chess and cards, and he read aloud, with beautiful intonation, soft and rhythmic, that gently lulled them to sleep, after dinner, by the light of the ancient candle in Posidorio's living room, which resounded with words and footsteps. Chapter 4. The day came when the liberal considered himself obliged by delicacy to announce his departure, because his strength, already recovered, allowed him to return to the battlefield in search of his companions. He left his soul there, which was Berta, but I had to go. The brothers did not allow it. They made him understand in 1,000 roundabout ways that the longer he delayed fighting the Carlists again, the better he would pay for that hospitality and that life that he said he owed to the Rondelligos. Also, and above all, they were so pleased with his company. They lived one and the other in a delicious interim, forgetful of political grudges, of everything that was beyond those woods, green frame of the idyllic picture of Susukasa. The captain allowed himself to be defeated. He stayed in Posidorio longer than he should have, and one day, when the forces of his body and the strength of his love had reached a degree of intensity that produced in him a delicious and dangerous harmony, he fell, helplessly, at Berta's feet, as soon as the chance to see her alone came to tempt him. And she, who did not understand a word of those things, began to cry, and when a crazy kiss came to burn her lips and her soul, she could only protest crying with love and fear, all mixed up and confused. It was not that day when he lost his honor, but later, in the garden, under a real laurel that smelled of glory. It was at dusk. The blind brothers had left her and the captain alone at home. They had gone hunting, an exercise still too painful for the convalescent who wanted to go to war early. A lonely nightingale sang in the neighboring Carbieta, a nightingale like the one heard enraptured with love by the sublime Saint Dulcilina, the sister of the venerable Bishop Hugues de Dignes. "Oh, what a lonely song that of that bird," said the saint, and immediately she remained in ecstasy, absorbed in God by the song of that bird. This is how Salimbino speaks. That's how Berta stayed. The nightingale made her faint, lose the strength with which she resists, which are harsh, cold, an infinite poetry that fills everything with love and indulgence flooded his soul. He lost the idea of good and evil. There was no evil, and absorbed by the song of that bird, she fell into the arms of her captain, who played Tenorio there without a trace of malice. Perhaps if the liberal, who owed his life to her, had not been present, Berta, listening to the solitary nightingale that afternoon, would have sworn to be another Dulcilina, and to love God, and only God, with the sweet name of Jesus. In the solitude of the cloister, or like Santa Dulcilina, in the world, in the century, but in that century of Susukasa, which was lonelier than a convent, in any case, surely that day, at such an hour, under that laurel, before that song, Berta would have wept with infinite love, would have consecrated her life to her cult. When circumstances allowed the captain to think about the civil aspect of his supreme happiness, he offered himself, as lover and gentleman, to return to Posidorio as soon as possible, renounce his weapons, and ask his brothers for his wife's hand. That a liberal warrior would not be given it. Berta, completely innocent, understood that something serious had happened, but not the irreparable. He was silent, more for the sweetness of the mystery than for terror of the consequences of his revelations. The captain promised to marry again. It was good. That wasn't too much, but happiness was already in her soul. I would wait 100 years. The captain, like a coward, flees the danger of death. He returns to his flags for ceremony, to comply, willing to save the body and ask for the absolute. His life is not his own, he thinks, it is Berta's honor. But the man proposes and the hero disposes. One afternoon, at the same time that the nightingale of Berta and Santa Dulcinea sang, the liberal captain hears the bronze singing the hymn of war, like a supreme love, glorious death calls him from a trench, his soldiers wait for the example, and the captain sets it, and in a delight of holy courage he surrenders his body to bullets, and his soul to God, that brave man who was only happy twice in his life, and both times to cause misfortune and engender a wretch. All of this, translated into the only language that the Rondaligos brothers wanted to understand, meant that an infamous liberal, sullying hospitality, gratitude, friendship, trust, law, virtue, everything holy, had stolen their honor and had fled. They never heard from him. Neither does Bertha. She did not know that the chosen one of her soul had not been able to return to look for her to fulfill the church and the world, because an indomitable instinct had forced him to fulfill his flag before. The captain had left Zaernin the day after his venture. No one knew of the dishonor that she left there, until, to the astonishment and terror of the brothers, to the astonishment and without terror of Berta, the unfortunate woman fell ill with an illness that ended in a mysterious and hidden baptism. As far as possible, like an ignominy, Berta began to understand her fault because of her punishment. Her son was stolen, and the brothers, the thieves, left her alone in Posidorio with Isabel and other servants. The inheritance, which remained undivided, was divided, and Berta was left, in addition to the little that fell to her, the usufruct of all of Susacasa, including Posidorio. Since she had stained the manor house by sinning there, she was left the place of her dishonor, where she would be more hidden than anywhere. She understood well, when she gave up hope that her captain would return, that the world would henceforth be for the disgraced young woman that lost corner, hidden by the greenery that surrounded it and almost submerged it. Many years passed before the Rondaligos began, if not to forgive, then to forget. Two died with their grudges, one in the war, into which he threw himself desperately, another in emigration, months later. Both had spent their entire estate in the service of the cause they defended. The other two also contributed their property to Don Carlos, but they did not expose the body to bullets. They grew old, and these were the ones who, from time to time, revisited the theater of their dishonor. They no longer called it that. The secret they had known how to keep had taken away much of its bitterness from dishonor. Later, the passing years had poured over Berta's fall that prescription that time tends, like a cloak of indulgence made of layers of dust, over everything conventional. Death, approaching, brought to the Rondaligos thoughts of more positive seriousness. Old age silently forgave youth for distant errors of which she, due to her illness, was not even capable. Berta had forgiven herself too, hardly thinking about it, but she continued in the seclusion that had been imposed on her, and that she had accepted out of pleasure, out of habit, like the bird in Lope's sonnet, the one that turned away because it did not see a woman cry. Berta came to not understand life outside of Posidorio. To the concern of his adventure, little by little forgotten, in what it had of stain and sin, not as a poetic memory, which subsisted and was accentuated in subtlety in old age, family concerns followed, that fight with all society and with all commoner contact. But if Berta had forgiven herself for her fault, in the depths of her soul she did not forgive her brothers for stealing her son, who while she was young. Although it hurt infinitely, it seemed legitimate, but when the maturity of her judgment brought her indulgence for the horrific sin of which she had previously been accused, the mother's conscience regained her strength, and not only did she not forgive her brothers, but she also did not forgive herself. Yes, he said to himself, I should have protested, I should have claimed the fruit of my love, I then had to look for him at all costs, not believing my brothers when they assured me that he had died. When it occurred to Berta to rise up, find out the whereabouts of her son, find out if she was being deceived by announcing his death, it was already too late. Or indeed he had died, or at least had been lost. The Rondaligos had behaved at this point with the special cruelty of fanaticisms that sacrifice to absolute abstractions the relative realities that reach the bowels. Those good, kind, sweet, gentlemen without blemish, were 4 Herods against a single creature, who seemed to them a shame of their lineage. He was the son of the liberal, of the traitor, of the infamous. Keeping him close, taking care of him, and exposing himself with these cares to the discovery of his relations with the bastard nephew, seemed to the Rondaligos such madness, like casting a bell with scandalous metal and hanging it from a rooftop in Posidorio, so that day and night he was touching the ignominy of his race, the eternal, irreparable shame of his own. Absurd! The accursed son was handed over to some mercenaries, with no guarantees of security, hastily, with no other precautions than those that forever removed suspicions that could go in search of the origin of that creature. The only thing that was attempted was to surround him with money, assure him of the bread, and this contributed to its disappearance. He disappeared. Erasing traces, some on one side, for the point of honor, and others on the other, out of interest and greed, all traces became impossible. When the conscience accused the Rondaligos that were still alive, and asked them to look for the lost child, there was no remedy. The interest, the selfishness of these good people was glad to have devised that hoax about the death of the poor child some time ago. First, she had lied to punish the infamous one who still dared to ask for the fruit of her enormous sin. Then she lied to herself so that she would not despair of pain, cursing the executioners of her happiness as a mother. The last 2 Rondaligos died in Posidorio, 2 years apart. Berta dared not ask the first, who was the older brother, anything at the time of death. Near the bed, while he was dying, head clear, words ready, Berta, standing, looked at him with a deep look, without ask not with the eyes, but thinking of the son. The dying brother also sometimes looked into Berta's eyes, but he said nothing of that answer that he had to give without the need for a question. He said nothing neither with lips nor with eyes. And yet, Berta guessed that he was also thinking of the dead or lost child. And soon after, she herself closed, drowning in tears, those eyes that carried away a secret. When the last brother died, Berta, who was left alone in the world, threw herself on the skinny chest of the one who was expiring, and with no compassion other than for her own anguish, she asked desolately, invoking God and the memory of her parents, who neither he nor she had met, asked about his son. Died? Died? Do you know for sure? Swear to me, Augustine, swear to me by the Lord, whom you will see face to face. And Augustine, the youngest of the Rondaligos, looked at his sister, no longer seeing her, and wept the tear with which souls usually say goodbye to the world. Berta was left alone with Sable and the cat, and she began to age rapidly, until she became parchment, and began to live the life of the bark of a dry oak. Inside was also parchment, but like 2 diamond crystallizations. Between so much dryness, 2 feelings remained, which took on in her the automatic character of the mania that moves in the mind with the tick-tock of a pendulum. The solitude, the isolation, the purity and cleanliness of Posidorio, Susakasa, Aran. Around here the pendulum went up to the mouse-like activity of that skinny, yellowish old woman, she, who was so white and round, who, deaf and light on her feet, she went up and down, hanging up clothes, giving orders to mow the meadows, prune the trees, clean the grass. But, in the midst of this activity, contemplating the immaculate greenery of her lands, the solitude and remoteness of Susakasa, she was surprised by the memory of the liberal, of her captain, traitor or not, of her dead or lost son, and the poor 70-year-old was crying for her child, whom she had always loved with a somewhat abstract love, without the power of imagination to imagine it. She cried and loved her son with the warm affection of a grandmother, lukewarm, but stubborn. And here the pendulum of automatic thinking descended to the sadness of fainting, of the shadows and coldness of the spirit, complaining of the world, of destiny, of her brothers, of herself. Sabellona only knew half of this oscillation of her existence, the notorious, the active, the material. As in the time of her brothers, Berta was still condemned to absolute solitude for the most delicate, poetic, fine and sad part of her soul. The old women, spinning by the light of the oil lamp in the kitchen, which had a hearth on the ground, looked like two mummies, and they were. But the one, Sable, slept in peace, the other, Berta, had a little mouse, a crazy spirit inside her skin. Sometimes Berta, after having talked about laundry for an hour, would be silent for a while, not replying to Sable's observations, and then, in silence, she looked at the maid with little eyes that burst with the torment of ideas, and she imagined that that other woman, who guessed nothing of her grief, of the wheel of painful ideas that she was going through by the head, it was not a woman, it was an old ivory spinner. Chapter 5. One afternoon in August, when the sun was no longer burning and out of the corner of its eye shined the white clothes spread out in the sloping orchard, and lit a diamond at the tip of each grass, which, cut short by the scythe, looked like the tip of a steel, Donna Berta, after contemplating from the house above the whiteness and greenness of her domain, with a breeze of unmotivated joy in her soul, began to hum one of those romantic ballads that she had learned in her innocent youth, and that he liked to remember when he wasn't too sad, not Sable in front, not close. In the maid's presence, his age-old sentimentality embarrassed him. But in complete solitude, the deaf lady sang without hearing herself inside, with a pitch as constant as it was melancholic, a kind of airs that could be called the plain song of musical romanticism. The words, scarcely pronounced, were no less sentimental than the music, and always referred to great conflicted passions or the idyllic repose of a pastoral and candid love. Donna Berta, after taking a look through the branches of pear and apple trees to see if Sable was down there, ascertained that there was no such disturbance in the orchard, threw the pearls of her repertoire into the air, and while, bent over and watering can in hand, she was cooling pepper plants, and cleaning trees and bushes of snails, her itch was to do several tasks at once, her trembling voice said, "Come, shepherdess, to my cabin. Leave the mountain, leave the meadow. Let your cattle happy. And come with me to the sea." He reached the end of the orchard, and in front of the shutter that communicated with the mountain, a forest of oaks, pines, and chestnut trees, he stood up and meditated. He had fancied going out there, going up the mountain between ferns and brambles. It had been years since such a thing had occurred to him, but at that moment he felt a little winter sun in his soul. The body asked him for adventures, daring. How many times, in front of that shutter, hidden among dark foliage, had his youth dreamed that his happiness was going to enter through there, the unexpected, the poetic, the ideal, the unheard of. Later, when he waited for his dream of flesh and blood, to his captain who did not return, through that shutter he was waiting for him too. He turned the key, lifted the latch, and went out into the woods. After a few steps he had to sit down on the holy ground, separating thorns with his hand. The slope was arduous for her, besides, tall ferns and spiked plants got in the way. Sitting in the shade she continued singing. and together in my boat. A noise in the undergrowth, which he heard when he was very close, silenced him, like a bird surprised in its solitudes. He stood up, looked up, and saw in front of him a handsome young man, about 30 to 35 years old, dark-haired, strong, with a long beard, and dressed, albeit carelessly, in a jacket and flexible bowler hat, pants that were too wide. With clothes that should be good and elegant, in short, he seemed to her a young man from the court, despite the slovenliness. Hanging from a shoulder strap, it carried a box. They looked at each other in silence, both standing still. Dona Berta saw that the stranger was finally greeting her, and without hearing him, she answered, bowing her head. She was not afraid, why? But I was stunned and a little upset. Such a gentleman, so far away, how had he ended up in the forest of Susukasa? If he didn't go anywhere there, if that was the filibuster of... She was slightly offended by a traveler passing through her domain. They came to explain themselves. She bluntly told him that she was deaf, and she loves everything she saw. And who was he? What was he doing there? Although the reception was not very courteous, both were understanding that they liked each other. She understood more, that that gentleman was admiring her. Within a few words they spoke like good friends. The exquisite kindness of both of them overcame the harshness of suspicion, and when minutes later they entered through the shutter into the orchard, Dona Berta already knew who that man was. He was an illustrious painter, who while he left his latest masterpiece hanging in Madrid where half of Spain was admiring it, and left the critics busy singing the praises of his palette, he fled from the incense and noise, and alone with his muse, loneliness, he traveled the Asturian valleys and byways, his summer loves, in search of effects of light, shades of the green of the earth and the gray of the sky. Inch by inch he knew all the secrets of natural beauty of those folds of the Marina, and finally, bolder or more fortunate than Romans and Moors, he had arrived, breaking through undergrowth and all kinds of thickets, to the very forest of Zaernan and the very mount of Susukasa, which was like reaching the kidney of mystery. Do you like all this? Dona Berta would ask the painter, smiling at him, the two of them sitting on a sofa in the living room, which resonated with her words and footsteps. Yes, ma'am, a lot, replied the painter with a voice and a gesture so that he could be understood better. And he added under his breath. And I like you too, famous old woman, human shopkeeper. Indeed, the illustrious artist was delighted. The meeting with Dona Berta had made him understand the interest that a soul that inhabits it can give to the landscape. His house, which had made him sing, upon discovering its thickets and greenery, remembering Gaillard. O Paradiso! Tu m'appartieni. It suddenly acquired a dramatic sense, a spiritual intention when that thin figure appeared in the middle of the mountain, full of drawing in its weakness, and whose colors could be summed up by saying, wax, tobacco, ash. Wax the skin, ash the head, tobacco the eyes and the dress. Little by little, Dona Berta had been choosing, without realizing it, gowns and shawls the color of dead leaves, and as for her hair, something curly. When it dried it had remained in a certain hue that was not silver white, but the memory of the ancient color, more melancholy than pure white, like that obstinate rosicler of twilight on long days, which does not decide to give up the horizon to the black of night. It seemed to the painter that lady with those colors and that ogival design, a copy of an ivory miniature. It seemed to him an escape from the country of a precious fan of remote date. According to him, it must have smelled of sandalwood. The artist accepted the chocolate and canned candy that Dona Berta offered him very willingly. They refreshed in the orchard, under a real laurel, son or grandson of the other. They had talked a lot. Although he had tried to keep the conversation in the shadows, to better observe, and all the light was to fall on the story of the old woman and on her domains, the curiosity of Dona Berta, and finally the pleasure that always causes to communicate our sorrows and hopes to people who are intelligent at heart, made the same painter forget his studio at times to think about himself. He also told his story, which came to be a series of dreams and another series of pictures. His character was in his paintings. Rich nature, smiling, but mysterious, almost sacred, and sweet, endearing, sad or heroic figures, always modest, demure, and healthy. He had painted a love he had had in a fountain. The public had also fallen in love with his colleague, but he, the painter, returning in the spring, perhaps to marry her, found her dying of consumptive. As this memory hurt the painter a lot, out of selfishness he again forgot himself, and by association of ideas, with piquant curiosity, he dared to ask that lady, among 1,000 delicacies, if she had not had love affairs and what had become of them. And Dona Berta, before that sweetness, before that candor portrayed in that smile of the dark genius, full of beards, faced with that pain of a lover who had been loyal, she felt her chest full of dead youth, as if the presence of an apparition, her love, flooded it with mysterious light, and with the playful and adventurous spirit that had made him sing a little while before and go out into the woods. He decided to talk about his love affairs, omitting the dishonorable incident, although with such bad art that the painter, a man of the world, tying up the dots and clarifying obscurities that he had noticed in the previous narration referring to the Rondaligos, he came to suppose something very similar to the truth that was hidden, equal in substance. So when she asked him if, in his opinion, the captain had been a traitor or had died in the war, he could see in her courage the kind of treason that should be attributed to the liberal, and he was inclined to think, for the character that she had painted in him, that Dona Berta's lover had not returned, because he had not been able to. And the two remained silent, thinking of different things. Dona Berta thought, "It seems incredible, but it is the first time in my life that I have spoken to another of these things." And it was true, those words had never been on her lips, they were the whole story of her soul. The painter, coming out of his meditation, suddenly said something like this. "It seems to me at this moment to see the cause of the eternal absence of your captain, ma'am. A noble spirit like yours, a gentleman of the quality of the one you described to me, returns from the war to fulfill a promise to his beloved, unless glorious death grants him its favors first. Its captain, in my opinion, did not return, because, when he went to collect the absolute, he found the absolute, the duty, that liberal, who by the blood of his wounds deserved to know you and be loved, my respectable friend, that captain, by his blood, lost the achievement of his love. As if you saw it, ma'am, he didn't come back because he died like a hero." Dona Berta was going to speak, whose little eyes shone with a kind of mystical madness, but the painter held out a hand, and went on to say, "Here our history comes together, and you will see how, speaking of the reason for my last painting, the one that locals and strangers praise me, without deserving so much praise, it is explained why I presume, I feel, that your captain behaved like mine. I also have my captain. He was a bosom friend, that is to say, we do not treat each other for a long time, but his death, his glorious and beautiful death, made him the intimate of my visions of a painter who aspires to put a heart on a face. My last picture, ma'am, the one that even you, who wants nothing to do with the world, knew something from the newspapers that come wrapping chickpeas and sugar, is, surely the least bad of mine. Do you know why? Because I saw it suddenly, and I saw it in reality first. Years ago, during the Second Civil War, although already known and esteemed, had not reached what is called celebrity, and I accepted, because it suited my budget and my plans, the position of correspondent that a foreign illustrated newspaper gave me. He offered to draw pictures of current affairs, of Spanish customs, and mainly of the war. With this assignment, and my great fondness for strong emotions, and my desire to collect data, worthy of credibility for a great picture of military heroism that I dreamed of, I went to the war in the North, determined to see everything up close. The most serious of combats, so that the danger of my own person facilitated this desired proximity. So I looked for danger, not because of it, but because I was close to heroic death. It is said, and famous writers have even said it, that in war everyone sees nothing great, nothing poetic. This is not true, for a painter. At least for a painter of my character. Well, good, in that war I met my captain. He allowed me what perhaps discipline did not authorize, to be sometimes where a soldier should be. My captain was a brave man and a player, but he played so well, he was so honorable, that the game in him seemed a virtue, due to the many good qualities that it gave him the opportunity to exercise. One day I told him about his reckless daring, and he frowned. "I'm not reckless," he told me grumpily, "not even brave. I have an obligation to be almost a coward. At least I must look for my life. My life is not mine, it's from a creditor. A comrade, an officer, not long ago freed me from death, which I was going to give myself, because, for the first time in my life, I had gambled what I did not have. I had lost an amount that I could not deliver to the contrary. My companion, surprising my despair, which was leading me to suicide, came to my aid. I paid with your money, and now I owe money, life and gratitude." But the friend warned me, after it was already impossible to return that sum, that with it he had placed his honor in my hands. "Live," he told me, "to pay myself by working, saving, as you can, that amount that I could have today, and I had to save your life. I will have to deliver it one day, and if I don't deliver it, I lose fame. He lives to help me get that fortune back and save my honor. Two honors, yours and mine, therefore hang on my existence. So, Mr. Artist, I flee or must flee from the bullets. But I have two vices, war and gambling, and since I should neither play nor die, as soon as I can honorably, I will ask for the absolute one, and, in the meantime, I will be very prudent here." That's how, ma'am, my captain spoke to me more or less, and I noticed that the next day, in a meeting, he did not venture too far, but weeks passed, there were clashes with the enemy and he returned to being reckless, but I did not tell him again that I thought so. Until, finally, the day of my painting arrived. The painter stopped. He took a breath, reflected in his own way, that is to say, he recomposed the painting in his imagination, not according to his masterpiece, but according to what reality had offered it to him. Donna Berta, astonished, thanking the artist for the voices he gave so that she would not lose a single word, listened to the story of the famous painting, and learned that on a cold, ashen day, a decisive battle had led the soldiers of that captain to the extreme of despair, which ends in shameful flight or heroism. They were all going to flee, when the gambler, the one who owed his life to a creditor, threw himself into certain death, as he threw all his fortune at a card, and death surrounded him like a halo of fire and blood. To death and glory he dragged many of his own with him. But before there was a moment, the one that had been recorded as in the light of a lightning bolt in the artist's memory, filling his fantasy, a moment when on top of a redoubt, the player-captain shone alone, as if in an apotheosis, while lower and further the soldiers wavered, terror and doubt painted on their faces. The gesture of that man, the one that miraculously I was able to preserve with absolute attitude and transfer it to my idea, had a singular expression, which separated him from everything classic and everything conventional. There were no canonical lines that could show the enthusiasm for war, the exalted patriotism. It was something else very different. There was pain, there were remorse. There was blind passion and the sovereign impulse in those eyes, in that forehead, in that mouth, in those arms. It was well seen that that soldier fell into a heroic death as into the abyss of a fascinating temptation that he resists in vain. The public and critics have fallen in love with my captain. Each one has translated in his own way that ideality of the face and of the whole gesture, but everyone has seen in it the best of the painting, the best of my brush. They see a mysterious spiritual struggle, of intense force, and they admire without understanding, beginning to guess when explaining their admiration. I know the secret of my triumph. This is what I saw that day, madam, in that man who disappeared among the smoke, the blood, and the panic, which later came to obscure everything. The rest of us had to flee to the Cape. His heroism was useless, but my painting will preserve its memory. What the world will not know is that my captain died breaking his word not to look for danger. That's how mine died. Dona Berta exclaimed excitedly, standing up, holding out a hand as if inspired. Yes, my heart screams that he too abandoned me for glorious death. And Dona Berta, who in her life had never used the phrases or gestures of a sibyl, dropped into her chair, crying with a solemnity that overwhelmed the painter and made him think of a statue of history shedding tears on the anonymous dust of the dark heroisms, of the great unknown virtues, of the great pains without chronicle. A cold breeze passed, the old woman trembled, got up, and with a gesture indicated the painter to follow her. They returned to the living room, and Dona Berta, half stretched out on the sofa, continued to sob. Chapter 6. Sabellona entered silently and turned on all the lights in the silver chandeliers that adorned a console. It seemed to her that it was quite an inspiration, to give tone to the house, that occurrence of illuminating, without anyone ordering it, the dark living room. Night was closing in on us without the painter or Dona Berta noticing. While she hid her face with her hands so that Sable wouldn't see her tenderness, the artist began to walk his deep and alive emotions around the long room, head down. But as he reached the console, the light caught his attention. He raised his head, looked around, and saw on the wall, face to face, the portrait of a young woman dressed and coiffed in the fashion of 46 years ago. More years. It took him a while to distinguish those features well, but when at last the whole picture came into full clarity, he felt a zizzes of a whiplash-like chill all over his body. By signs, he asked Sabellona who the painted lady was, and Sable, with another gesture and great calm, pointed to the old woman, who continued with her face hidden in her hands. Sabellona left the room on tiptoe, for this was her way of respecting the pain of her masters when she did not understand them, and the painter, who, pale and as if afraid, continued contemplating the portrait, did not feel that 2 tears welled up in his eyes. And when he returned to his walk on the chestnut boards, which creaked, he was thinking, these things do not fit in the painting. Furthermore, because of what is casual and implausible, they do not fit in poetry either. They only fit in the world, and in the hearts that know how to feel them. And he stopped to look at Dona Berta, who, already more serene, had stopped crying, but with her hands crossed on her skinny knees, was looking at the ground with dull eyes. Dead love, like an apparition, passed through that wrinkled, rigid heart again, like a perfumed breeze in the gardens, which later kisses the marble of the tombs. My friend, said the old woman, getting to her feet and wiping away the last tears with her skinny fingers, which looked like roots, talking about my things. Time has passed, and you can no longer seek shelter elsewhere. The night comes. I'm sorry for what they will say, he added, smiling. But you have to stay for dinner and sleep in Posidorio. The painter accepted willingly and without the need for requests. I plan to pay for the inn, he said. As? Taking out a copy of that portrait tomorrow, some notes to make later in my house, another one, that is like that, in terms of its resemblance to the original, if it has one. They say yes, Donna Berta interrupted, shrugging her shoulders with a posthumous modesty, graceful in its sad indifference. They say, he continued, that one drop resembles another drop, like a Berta Rondalliego, of which I barely remember. Well then, my copy, without boasting, will be somewhat less bad than that, as a painting, and exactly true in resemblance. And said and done. The next morning, the painter, who had slept on the walnut bed where the last Rondalliego had expired, got up very early. He had the painting taken to the garden, and there, in the open air, he began his work. He ate with Donna Berta, watching her attentively when she wasn't looking, and after coffee he continued his work. In the middle of the afternoon, having finished her notes, she collected her belongings, said goodbye with a warm hug to her new friend, and along the Aran disappeared into the thicket, saying her last goodbye from afar with a white handkerchief that fluttered like a flag. Once again, Donna Berta was left alone with her thoughts, but how other were they? His captain, surely, had not returned because he had not been able to. He had not been a villain, as the brothers said, he had been a hero. Yes, the same as the other one, the painter's captain, the player who played until honor to win glory. Donna Berta's remorse, which was even more than remorse, became more and more irritated from that day when a hunch made her believe with living faith that her lover had been a hero, that he had died in the war, and that was why he had not come back to look for her. Because being so, what accounts could he ask of his son? What had she done to find the fruit of her love? Little more than nothing. She had allowed herself to be terrified, and she remembered with horror the days when she herself had come to believe that it was driving home the nail in her ignominy to undertake clandestine inquiries in search of her son. And now, how late it was already for everything. The son, or had indeed died, or had been lost forever. It was not possible to dream of his trail. She herself had lost her mother in her bowels, was already a grandmother. A vague conscience told him that he could not feel with the force of other times. The minutiae of ordinary life, the prose of her chores distracted her at every moment from her pain, from her meditations. They came back, it was true, but they didn't last long in her head, and that constant rhythm of forgetting and remembering made her dizzy. She herself came to think, it's just that I'm drunk. This is a hobby, more than a feeling. And yet, at times she thought, particularly after dinner, before going to bed, while she walked through the spacious kitchen by the light of Saballona's lamp, she thought that there was a hidden energy in her that would lead her to a great sacrifice, to an absolute self-sacrifice, if there was a matter for this. Oh! Where would I go for my son, dead or alive? To kiss her bare bones, what years I would not give, if not of life, which I can no longer offer it, what years of glory spending more in purgatory? Or because I am like a tomb, a soul that is already decomposing, or because I have a presentiment of death, I always inadvertently think, when I imagine that I am looking for and finding my son, that I give with his remains, not with his open arms to embrace me. Imagining these and other similar bitterness, Donna Berta was surprised by the message that, after 8 days, the painter sent her by his own. A villager, who immediately disappeared without expecting a tip or refreshments, left a large package in Dona Berta's possession containing a card from the painter and 2 oil portraits. One was that of Berta Rondallego, a faithful copy of the painting that was on the console in Posidorio's living room, but an idealized copy full of expression and life, thanks to true art. Dona Berta, who barely recognized herself in the portrait in the living room, upon looking at the new one, suddenly saw herself in a mirror, from more than 40 years ago. The other portrait that the painter sent him had a caption at the bottom, which said in small, red letters, "My Captain." It was nothing more than a head. Dona Berta, looking at it, lost her breath and gave a cry of fright. That my captain was also hers, mixed with herself, with the Berta of 40 years ago, with the one who was there next to her. She brought together, confronted the fabrics. He saw the perfect resemblance that the painter had seen between the portrait of the salon and the captain of his memories, and of his masterpiece. But in addition, and above all, she saw another resemblance, even more accentuated, in certain features and in the general expression of that face, with the features and the expression that she could evoke from the image that lived in her brain, engraved with the burin of the indelible, as the drop carves the stone. The unique love, dead, always hidden, had embodied in his fantasy a fixed, indestructible image, similar in its way to that granite polished by the kisses of many generations of believers who go to cry and wait at the feet of a virgin or of a stone saint. The painter's captain was like a restoration of the portrait of the other captain that she saw in her brain, somewhat erased by time, with the dark patina of his hidden and prolonged cult, smoked by the holocaust of ancient love, as church pictures are smoked by wax and incense. This was because when Sabellona came to call Dona Berta, she found her pale, her face contorted and half faint. She said nothing more than, "I feel bad," and let the maid put her to bed. The next day the council doctor came, and he shrugged. He did not prescribe. "It's a thing of the years," he said. 3 days later, Dona Berta was running around the house again, more agile than ever, and with a sparkle in her eyes that looked like fever. Sabellona was astonished to see that the next morning a man of his own left Posidorio with a sealed letter. Who was the lady writing to? What could there be in the world, far away, that mattered to her? The mistress had written to the painter. He knew his name and the name of the council where he used to have his inn during the summer, but he did not know more, neither the name of the parish in which the artist's rustic hostel was, nor if he would be at home then, or very far away, on his ordinary excursions. He himself returned 4 days later, without an answer and without the letter from the young lady. After much effort, 1,000 inquiries, the letter had been accepted in the capital of the council, giving him assurances of delivering the sheet to the painter, who would be back at that inn where they told him this, within a week. Searching for him immediately was useless. It could be very close, or 20 leagues away. Days and days slipped by, and Dona Berta waited in vain, almost mad with impatience, for news of the painter. In the meantime, his letter, in which the secret of his honor was in the middle of words, was going around the world in the hands of God knew who. Sad weeks passed, and the poor old woman, with a very weak memory, began to forget what she had written to the painter. He only remembered, vaguely, that he implicitly declared his sin, and that he asked, for what he loved most, news of his captain. What was his name? Who was he? His origin, his family, and also wanted to know who had given that money to the poor hero who had died without paying. How would it be possible to find the creditor? And finally, what madness! I asked him about the painting, about the masterpiece. Was it still his? Was it already sold? How much could it cost? Would the money she had left, after selling everything she had and paying off the captain's creditor, be enough to buy the painting? Yes, he talked about all this in the letter, although he no longer remembered how, but what she was sure of was that he was not going back. In bed, in the few days that he had to stay in it, he had solved that madness, which he did not regret. Yes, it was resolved. He wanted to pay his son's debt, he wanted to buy the painting that represented his son's heroic death, and that contained his son's entire body at the moment of losing his life. She had no approximate idea of what Susukasa, Posidorio, and El Aran could be worth when sold. She was not even remote from her son's debt and the price of the painting. But it didn't matter. That's why he wanted to find out, that's why he had written to the painter. The reasons he had for his madness were very simple. She had not given anything of hers to the son of her womb, while the unfortunate man lived. Now she found him dead, and she wanted to give him everything. His son's honor was his. What he owed she owed, and she wanted to pay, and ask for alms, and if after paying there was money to buy the painting, buy it and starve to death, because it was like having the burial of the two captains, restoring their honor, and it was also having the faithful image of the adored son and the reflection of another adored image. Donna Berta felt that that very strong, absolute, irrevocable resolution of hers perhaps owed its strength to an invisible, extraordinary impulse that had entered her head like a foreign body that tyrannized everything. This, I thought, will be that I have definitely gone crazy, but, better, I'm more comfortable like this, I'm less restless like this. This resolution is a foothold. The material pain that comes from here is better than that insufferable ticking of my old remorse, that coming and going of the same ideas. Donna Berta, to encourage herself in her heroic resolution, to carry out her sacrifice without effort, out of her own desire and complacency, and not because of that irresistible impulse, but which did not seem her own, dedicated herself to irritating her maternal love, to seek tenderness of mother, and could not. His spirit labored in vain, the images that could move her did not come to her mind. I didn't know how to be a mother. He wanted to imagine his son, child, abandoned, without a lap for his innocence. He couldn't. The son she saw was a brave captain, standing on a redoubt, between fire and smoke. It was the head that the painter had given him. This is, he said to himself, as if I wanted to fall in love at my age, and couldn't. And yet his resolve was absolute. With or without the painter's help, she would find the painting, see it, oh yes, see it before she died. And find the creditor or his heirs, and pay them off her son's debt. It seems that there are two souls, he sometimes said to himself, one that dries up with the body, and is the one that imagines, the one that feels strongly, picturesquely, and another deeper, purer soul, that cries without tears, that loves without memory and even without heartbeat, and this soul is the one that God must take to heaven. After a few months had passed without any news from the painter, Donna Berta decided to act alone. There was no reason for Sabellona to know anything until the supreme moment, that of separating. Goodbye, Zairnin, goodbye Susukasa, goodbye Aran, goodbye Posidorio. The mistress received a visit that surprised Sable and gave her a bad feeling. Mr. Pumariega, D. Casto, a retired notary public and usurer in active service, country mouse, council sponge, great collector of takeaway bread farms and all kinds of real estate, showed up in Posidorio asking for the lady of Rondalliego with that eternal smile that had made all the helpless people of the region cry tears of blood. This gentleman lived in the capital of the council, several kilometers from Zairnin. He appeared on horseback. He got out, ordered, always smiling, that they put grass on the pony, but not the new one, and, thinking better of it, he went to the stable himself, and with his own hands he filled the manger with hay. He still had some herbs in his beard, and others stuck to the glass of his glasses, when Dona Berta received him in the living room, pale, with a trembling voice, but determined to sacrifice. He bluntly went to business. It would have been absurd and even shameful to inform Mr. Pumariega of the sentimental reasons for that strange resolution. Castro did not know why, but that was what Dona Berta needed, in money that she could carry in her pocket, everything that was worth it, well sold, su casa with her aran and posadorio included. The house, its dependencies, the losa, the forest, the meadow, everything, but in money. If they gave her the rooms on loan, with a mortgage on the said farms, well, she wasn't going to pay much interest, because he expected to die soon, and Mr. Pumariega could bear everything, if he didn't want this business, the round sale. When Mr. Pumariega was going to be astonished by Rondaliego's almost supernatural resolution, he remembered that it would be much more useful to proceed immediately to consider the advantages of the deal, without surprise of any kind. Admiration was out of the question, especially from the moment a good deal was proposed to him. Thus, as if it were a question of selling him a few apple seeds or that autumn's herb, Castro entered fully into the matter, without expressing surprise or even curiosity. And following his custom, when presenting his arguments to demonstrate the advantages of the mortgage loan, he called the contracting parties A and B, lender B, mortgage H, property C. This is how Don Castro spoke, who hated personalities, and never saw a living being, a similar one, on the opposite side, but rather a letter, an element of a formula that had to be eliminated. Dona Berta, who by dint of managing her interests for many years had acquired some experience and some malice, saw herself as a fly in a spider's web, but he cared little. Castro insisted on wanting to deceive her, on making her see that she wasn't necessarily losing su casa in the combinations he proposed. She pretended to fall for the trap. He understood that Pumariega emerged as owner of the Rondalliego domains from that adventure, but that was precisely what the sacrifice consisted of. That's what she was going for, to be crucified by that Saiyan. And once this was decided, what had her yearning, hanging on the lips of the Jew, obsequious, even flattering and servile, was the amount, the thousands of dollars that the field mouse was to give her. When Castro set numbers, Dona Berta felt her heart jump with joy. The usurer offered far more than she could hope for. He did not believe that his depleted and impoverished domains could answer for so many thousands of duros. When Pumariega was leaving Posadorio, Sabellona and the landlord, who were helping him mount, looking at him out of the corner of their eyes, saw him smile as always, but also his little eyes gave off sparks that crossed the lenses of his glasses. Shortly after, at a height that dominated Zaernan, Don Castro stopped and turned his horse to contemplate the perimeter and the fine appearance of his new possessions. He always called possession, out of false modesty, what he knew how to make his own with all the anchors and claws of the Trinitarian domain that the sealed paper in the registry books provided him with. 3 days later Pumariega was back in Posadorio accompanied by the new notary, his work, and various witnesses and experts, all his debtors. It was not as simple and brief as Dona Berta wanted, and she had figured, leaving all the wool at the mercy of Mr. Pumariega's cold scissors. He wanted assurances of 1,000 kinds and to stun the opposing party, by dint of ceremonies and legal complications. The only thing that Mrs. Berta opposed with all her energy was to appear in the capital of the council. Not that, she did not want to move from Susacasa, until the day she left to take the train to Madrid. Everything was arranged, finally, and Donna Berta saw the moment to have in her little chest of ancient secrets the thousands of dollars that the usurer lent her. She well understood that she was saying goodbye to Posidorio, to Aaron, to everything forever. How was she ever going to pay that money they gave her? How could he even pay the interest if he lived a few years? There could be a miracle. Just so. If the miracle came, Susukasa would continue to be hers, and this hope was always an advantage, or at least a consolation. Yeah, I lost everything. But the point was to pay off his son's debts, buy the painting, and then starve if necessary. And Sabella? D. Casto had clearly made it clear that he needed guarantees for the security of his mortgage through the vigilance of a very diligent father of a family over the assets in which said mortgage consisted. He had no objection to the landlord continuing with the hunt for now, but as for Posidorio's keys and taking care of the palace and its dependencies, he preferred that they run at his own expense. So Sabellona could not stay in Posidorio. The mistress hesitated before proposing to take her with her. It was a matter of expense. Economies had to be made, diminishing her wealth as little as possible, which she did not know if she could reach the debt and the price of the painting. Every expense that could be dispensed with had to be eliminated. Sabellona was one more mouth, one more guest, one more traveler. Almost double spending. Nevertheless, promising to save this expense in the gift of her own person, Donna Berta proposed to the maid to take her to Madrid with her. Sabellona did not have the courage to accept. She had not gone mad like the mistress, and she saw the danger. Too many misfortunes fell on him without looking for that other, the greatest, certain death. She to Madrid. He had always thought of such things from so far away vaguely, like in the afterlife. I wasn't sure there were countries so far from Susukasa. Madrid. The train, so many people, so many paths. Impossible. That the mistress excused, but Sable did not reach that extreme in her affection and loyalty. A heroic action was asked of her, and she did not end there. Sabellona, like St. Peter, denied her lady, deserted her ideal madness, abandoned her in danger, at the foot of the cross. Just as if Donna Berta were dying, Sabellona would feel it infinitely, but she would not accompany her to the grave, so she would abandon her by the side of the Madrid road. The maid had some distant relatives in a neighboring council, and she would go there, despite herself, during the mistress's absence, since Mr. Pumariega wanted to take Posidorio's keys, against all divine and human laws, according to Sable. But aren't you the mistress? What does he have to command here? Leave me with stories, Isabel. He sends everything he wants, because he is the one who gives me the money. This is already like yours. Donna Berta felt in her soul that her companion of so many years, of her whole life, abandoned her in the supreme crisis that she was risking, but she forgave the maid's weakness, because she herself needed all her courage, her unwavering resolution, to leave her house and enter that labyrinth of roads, towns, noise, and strange, enemy people. The poor lady sighed, and said to herself, since Sable isn't coming, I'll take the cat. When the maid found out that the cat was also leaving, she looked at him scared, as if consulting him. It didn't seem fair to her, let's face it, to abuse the poor animal because he couldn't say no, like her, but if she knew what they were getting her into, she was sure that the cat wouldn't want to accompany her owner either. Sable did not dare, however, to object, even though the little animal had brought her home. It was, strictly speaking, his. She couldn't take him to distant relatives either. 2 more mouths was too much. And he couldn't be left alone in Posidorio, especially not with Don Casto, who would starve him to death. It was decided that the cat would go to Madrid with Dona Berta. Chapter 7. One morning Sabellona got up from her chaste bed, leaned out of a kitchen window, looked at the sky, with one hand placed in front of her eyes as a screen, and with a sour expression and even more sour voice, she exclaimed, speaking to Alone, against their custom. "Nice day of travel." And immediately he thought, but without saying it, the last day. She lit the fire, swept a little, went to get fresh water, made her coffee, then her mistress's chocolate, and as if nothing extraordinary were going to happen there, he gave the orderly knock on the door of Dona Berta's bedroom, the usual way of indicating that breakfast awaited her, and she, Sable, as if it weren't all over that morning, as if what was going to happen in an hour wasn't some kind of end of the world for her, she gave herself up to the routine march of her domestic chores. Useless in a large part this time, since that night no one would sleep in Posidorio. While she was washing a bucket, through the garden shutter, which was at kitchen level, the cat came in, covered in dew, with the grass of that leaden and damp morning attached to its shiny white body. Sable looked at him with fondness, envy, and pity. And he said to himself, "Poor animal. He doesn't know what awaits him." The cat had positively made no travel arrangements. That life that he led, for him from time immemorial, surely seemed eternal to him. The possibility of a move did not enter his metaphysics. He began to lick plates from the dinner the day before, as a good Epicurean would have done in his case. Dona Berta entered silently. He saw the chocolate on the pastry table, and there, as always, he began to drink it. The preparations for the march had been made, down to the last detail, many days before. There was nothing more to leave, and, before, say goodbye. Mistress and maid barely spoke in that last scene of their common life. An hour passed, and Don Casto Pumariega arrived, who had taken care of everything with a kindness that no one had the courage to thank him for. He would take Mrs. Berta to the same station, the closest to Zaernan, check in the luggage, put her in a second-class car, Dr. Berta hadn't wanted first, to save money, and will walk. In Madrid the owner of a cheap boarding house was waiting for her. Don Casto had written to him, asking him to thank him for the favor of sending him a guest. He used to stop there when he went to Madrid, and he was so rich. The young man from whom Pumariega had rented a donkey on which Dona Berta was to ride to get to the station, 2 leagues from Posidorio, appeared in the kitchen with Don Casto. Mistress and maid, who had been so silent that they even seemed hostile to each other that morning, as if they were silently accusing each other of that separation, in the presence of those who came to look for her, they felt infinite tenderness and great fainting, they burst into tears, and wept for a long time in each other's arms. The cat stopped licking dishes and looked at them in amazement. That was new in that house where affection had no expression. They all loved each other, but they didn't caress each other. He himself gave himself a very good life, but no kisses or flattery. Just in case he approached the skirts of his old women and got bad. Towards Mr. Pumariega. Dona Berta asked Don Casto for a moment and went out through the orchard's shutter. He climbed the slope, reached the top, and from there he contemplated his domains. The undergrowth moved softly, glistening with moisture, and seemed to moan softly. Some sparrows screeched. Dona Berta did not even have the consolation of poeticizing the solemn farewell scene. Nature before his dull and worried imagination did not have that pity to personalize himself that usually gives so much relief to melancholic dreamers. Neither the Aran, nor the Losa, nor the forest, nor the palace told him anything. They stayed there, indolent, without memories of the absence. His selfishness was the same as Sable's, although more frank, the one the cat would have shown if they had consulted his will regarding the trip. It did not matter. Dona Berta did not feel loved by her lands, but instead she loved them infinitely. Yes, yes. In the world you don't just love men, you love things. The Aran, the Losa, the orchard, Posidorio, were something of her soul, by themselves, without the need to bring them together with memories of human love. You have to know how to love nature as true lovers love, despite disdain. To adore the idol, to adore the stone, what he does not feel and cannot reciprocate, is the supreme adoration. The best believer is the one who continues prostrate before the godless altar. The sparrows screeched. They seemed to say, to us, what are you telling us? You go, we stay, you are crazy, we are not, you are going to look for the portrait of your son, who you are not sure is your son. Go with God. But Dona Berta forgave the birds, finally children, and even the green Aran himself, who, even more cruel, kept silent. The forest complained, yes, but little, like a child who, tired of crying, turns his complaint into rhythm and has fun with his grief, and Dona Berta came to notice, with the clairvoyance of the supreme moments before nature, she came to notice that the forest did not complain because she was leaving. He always complained like that. That leaden and humid morning cold was one of the 1,000 forms of boredom that can be read so many times in nature. The forest complained, as always, of that boredom of how much lives attach to the earth and how much rolls through space in the world, subject to gravity like a chain. All the things she saw then appeared to her like convicts who lament their prisons and yet love their prison. She, since she was free, could, 6-9 break the chain, and she had broken it, but clinging to the chain, half of her soul remained. Bye-bye. Dona Berta called herself, wanting to go down quickly, and it didn't move. In his heart there was the pain of many generations of Rondaligos who said goodbye to their land, the father, the brothers, the grandparents, all there, in his chest and in his throat, choking with grief with her. But, Mrs. Berta, we are going to miss the train. He shouted down their Pumariega, and it sounded to her as if he were saying, you're going to lose the gallows. Don Casto and the Spolique were already in the courtyard, the executioner and his assistant, and also the donkey that Dona Berta had to ride to go to the post. The cat was in a basket. Chapter 8. Dawn was breaking, and the snow that was falling in piles, with its feline silence that has the treacherous air of a cat's gate, was throwing, layer upon layer, over the entire width of the Puerta del Sol, shovelfuls of ermine, which had already been erased from hours ago the footprints of late-night passers-by. All the doors were closed. There was only one ajar, that of the principal, a table with fritters, that someone had tried to take out into the open air, had been removed to the portal of the interior. Dona Berta, who was contemplating the spectacle from a corner of Calle del Carmen, did not understand why they let fritters be fried, or, at least, sold on the ministry's portal, but that was because the table had disappeared there, and behind it 2 guards and one who looked like a telegrapher. And the square was left alone, alone Dona Berta and the snow. The old woman was motionless, the feet, clad in galoshes, sunk into the softness, the open umbrella, as if lined with white cloth. As there, he thought, so will the Aran be. I went to Mass at dawn. The church was his refuge, only there did he find something that resembled what was there. She only felt united to her peers at court by religious bond. In the end, it was said, all Catholics, all brothers. And this reflection took away some of the fear that all strangers inspired in him, more than one by one, considered as a whole, as a crowd, as people. The mass was like the one she heard in Zaernin, in The Daughter of Pidaloro. The priest said the same and did the same. It was always a comfort. Hearing Mass every day was for this, but getting up so early was for something else. Contemplating deserted Madrid reconciled her a little with him. The streets seemed less inimical to him, more like the alleys, the trees most similar to real trees. He had wanted to walk around the outskirts, but they were so far away. His legs were so skinny, and the cars so expensive and so dangerous. Finally, once, twice, he reached the limits of that hamlet that seemed endless to him, but he renounced such discoveries, because the field was not a field, it was a desert, all brown. All dry. His heart tightened, and he felt infinite pity. I should have died without seeing this, without knowing that there was this desolation in the world. For a poor old woman from Susakasa, that corner of green joy is too sad to be so far from the true world, from the true earth, and to be separated from the freshness, from the grass, from the branches, by these leagues and leagues of stone and dust. Looking at the sad distance, he felt the impression of chewing dust and pawing at dry earth, and his hands twitched. She felt so alien to everything that surrounded her, that sometimes, in the middle of the stream, she had to contain herself so as not to ask for help, so as not to ask that they take her to her in for charity. Despite such sadness, she walked down the street smiling with fear at the crowd, whose court she was, whom she wanted to flatter, so they wouldn't hurt her. He left the sidewalk to everyone. Since she was deaf, she wanted to guess with her eyes if the passers-by she bumped into were saying something to her, and so he smiled, and nodded expressively, and murmured excuses. The crowd must have sympathized with the poor old woman, neat, vivacious, dressed in tobacco-colored silk. Many smiled at him too, they let him pass freely, no one had stolen it. Intended to defraud even so, she did not lose her fear, and seeing her stop and cross herself before leaving the doorway of her house would not suspect that it was heroism for that old woman every day to take to the streets. She was afraid of the crowd, but above all she was afraid of being run over, stepped on, crushed by horses, by wheels. Each car, each wagon, was a wild beast that pounced on him. She threw herself through the Puerta del Sol as a Christian martyr might enter the circus arena. The tram seemed to him a cautious monster, an insidious snake. The guillotine was imagined as something similar to the hidden wheels sliding like a blade on the two iron lines. The noise of wheels, footsteps, bells, whistles, and trumpets reached his confused, formidable brain, in its mysterious twilight of sound. When the tram came from behind and she noticed its proximity by signs that were almost guesses, by a kind of reflection of the approaching danger in the other passers-by, by a tremor of hers, by the indecisive noise, Donna Berta would move away with nervous lightness. It seemed impossible in an old woman. He gave way to the beast, turning his face to it, and he also smiled at the tram, and even made an involuntary bow to it, pure flattery, because in the depths of his soul he hated him. Especially as a traitor and treacherous. How was he on top of it? What barbarous and refined cruelty! Many passers-by had saved her from grave dangers, taking her from between the feet of horses or the wheels of carriages. They took her in their arms, they pushed her to save her from being run over. What a thank you from her! How she turned to her Savior, pouring out gestures and words of praise and recognition. I owe you my life. Gentlemen, if I could do something. I am very deaf, excuse me, but all I could. And those incidental providences left her speechless. Why am I so afraid of people, if there are so many good people who take them out of the jaws of death? She wouldn't be surprised if the indifferent crowd allowed her to be trampled by a horse, split in two by a wheel, without offering her a hand, without giving her a voice of warning. What did she have to do with all these strangers? What did she matter in the world, outside of Zaernan, better, of Susakasa? That is why she was so grateful to be helped to escape from a car, from the tram. She also wanted to serve others. Life on the street was, in his opinion, like a daily battle, into which all the inhabitants of Madrid entered carelessly and courageously, the battle of collisions, of abuses, because in that journey of endless dangers, she also wanted to help her fellow men, who were finally so, although so strange, so unknown. And he always walked with a sharp eye, substituting hearing with sight, with attention preoccupied with his steps and those of others. In each side street, in each paving stone passage, in each square there was a shooting, as he imagined, of carriages and horses, the greatest dangers, and upon reaching these tremendous moments of crossing the public highway, she redoubled her attention, and, with fear and everything, she thought of others as of herself, and great was her satisfaction when she could save a child, an old man, a poor old woman, like her, from such a mishap, to whoever it was. One day, at rush hour, from the sidewalk of the Imperial, he saw a drunkard crossing the Puerta del Sol, making big reversals, with 1,000 circumlocutions and periphrases of his feet, and meanwhile, trams, Ripperts and Simons, buses and carts, and horses and loaded porters came and went, like arrows that intersect in the air. And the serene drunkard, by dint of not being calm, walked exhausting his energy. Most complete treatise on curves, imitating all kinds of orbits and ecliptics, without even dreaming of danger, of that thunderous fire of certain deaths that he was traversing with his stumble. Dona Berta saw him advance, retreat, miraculously free from each setback, pursued in vain by the disdainful shouts of the coachman and horseman, and she, with her hands joined by the palms, prayed to God for that man from the sidewalk, as she could have prayed from the coast for the life of a shipwrecked man who drowned in her sight. And she didn't breathe until she saw the cute one in the safe harbor in the arms of a cop, who was taking him she didn't know where. Providence, the guardian angel, was watching, without a doubt, put the luck and the missteps of the drunkards of the court. That constant worry about noise, traffic, crashes and being run over, had become an obsession, a mania, the immediate constant material impression, repeated without ceasing, that separated her, in spite of herself, from her great thoughts, from her tormented life as a suitor. Yes, I had to confess it, she thought much more about the dangers of the masses of people, of the cars and trams, than about her lawsuit, about her enormous fight with those rich people who opposed her achieving the desire that had dragged her to Madrid. Without knowing how or why, since he had seen himself outside of Posidorio, his ideas and his heart had suffered a disorder, I thought and felt more selfishly. She was very sorry for herself, and she remembered death with horror. How horrible it must have been to go to nothing less than another world, when it was already such a great torment to take a few steps outside of Susakasa, through this same land, which, what is apparently, already seemed another. Ever since she had gotten into the train, she had been seized by a mad desire to turn back, to get off, to run in search of her loved ones, who were Sabellona and the trees, and the meadow and the palace, everything that left so far he lost track of distances, and it seemed to him that he had covered infinite spaces. I didn't think it was impossible to retrace what we've walked in less than centuries. And what a headache! And how fugitive the existence of all the others seemed to her, of all those strangers with no history, so indifferent, who came and went in the second-class car she was in, who asked her for tickets, who offered her services, who took her in a buggy to an inn. I was lost, lost in the great world, in the infinite universe, in a universe haunted by ghosts. He imagined that having so many people on earth, each one lost value, the life of this one, of the other, did not matter at all, and that's how other people must have thought, judging by the indifference with which they saw each other, spoke to each other, and separated forever. That weaves drive of life, that confusion of the people seemed to her like the swarms of mosquitoes from which she fled in the forest and by the river in summer. She spent a few days in Madrid without thinking about moving, without imagining that it was possible in any way to start her errands to find out what she needed to know, which was leading her to court. It had positively been crazy. For now, she thought of herself, of not dying of disgust at the table, of sadness in her inner room with views of a dirty alley they called a patio, of cold in the narrow, sordid, hard, miserable bed. She fell ill. 8 days in bed gave him some courage. She got up a little more willing to orient herself in that hell that she had not suspected existed in this world. The innkeeper became a friend. It had certain overtones of charity. Misery did not let her be completely. Dona Berta began to ask, to inquire. He left home. And that's when the street danger fever started. This fever was not to pass like the other. But anyway, between his terrors, between his battles, he came to find out something, that the painting he was looking for was deposited in a mansion closed to the public, where the government kept him until that it be decided whether he would stay with a minister or an American nobleman would take him to his palace in Madrid first, and then perhaps to his palace in Havana. All this he knew, but not the price of the painting, which he had not yet been able to see. And in this he was walking, in the footsteps of their claims to see him. That cold, snowy morning was a day that was going to be solemn for Dona Berta. They had offered him, through the influence of a fellow boarder, that he would be allowed to see, please, the famous painting, which was no longer on display to the public, but lying on the floor, to be packaged, in a cold and deserted room, there outside. Naughty coincidence. Or that day, or maybe never. There was a lot of snow to go through. It didn't matter. I would take a cab, for being extraordinary, if they let them circulate that day. He was going to see his son. To be well prepared, to win God's will so that everything turned out well for her in her daring claims, she first went to church, to Mass at dawn. The Puerta del Sol, snowy, lonely, silent, was a good omen. So it will be there. What a clean sheet! What spotless whiteness! No paths of mud and frost, no footprints. It looks like the snow of the Aran, which no one steps on. Chapter 9. In the church, dark, cold, lonely, he occupied a corner that he already considered his own. The lights from the altar and from the lamps brought a familiar warmth, from a dear home, to the depths of his soul. The priest's Latin murmurs, mixed with coughing from asthma, sounded like heaven to him, something from there. The images on the altars, which were vaguely lost in the shadows, spoke with their silence of the solidarity of heaven and earth, of the constancy of faith, of the unity of the world, which was the idea that Dona Berta was losing, without realize it is clear, in their hours of fear, decay, despair. She left the church encouraged, brave, ready to fight for her cause. To look for the sun, and the sun's creditors. The time came, after having a bad lunch, in a hurry and without appetite, She went out alone with her recommendation card, took a cab gave the address of the faraway barracks, and upon hearing the coachman blaspheme and seeing that he was hesitating, as if looking for an excuse not to go so far, Donna Berta said, smiling and persuasive, "4 hours," and little by little, step after step, a sad yellowish and emaciated animal dragged her up the street. Donna Berta, with her card in hand, overcame difficulties at the porter's office, and after walking from room to room, freezing to death, hearing the muffled thuds of many hammers hammering in drawers, she arrived in the presence of a fat man, badly dressed, which seemed to direct that noise and confusion of the change of art. The paintings were leaving, most of them had already left, on the walls there were almost none left. You had to be careful not to step on the canvases that covered the pavement, the thousands of dollars that carpet would be worth. It was the large paintings, some already famous, that lay stretched out on the platform. The fat man read Donna Berta's card, looked at the old woman squarely, and when she let him know by smiling and pointing to one ear that she was deaf, he made a bad face. Without a doubt, it seemed too great an effort to raise his voice a little in honor of that so insignificant being, recommended by anyone who believes himself to be friends and is known, indifferent. "So you want to see the painting of Valencia? Well, you almost stayed in Albi's, grandmother. In half an hour he'll be on his way home." "Where is it? Where is it? Which one is it?" she asked, trembling. "That." And the fat man pointed with a finger at a large sheet of grey cloth, as if dirty, that he had spread out at his feet. That. But, my God, you can't see anything." The other shrugged. "You can't see anything." Donna Berta repeated with terror, imploring compassion with her eyes and gestures and her trembling voice. "Clear. The canvases have not been made to be seen on the ground. But what do you want me to do to you? Have come before. I had no recommendation. The public could not enter here. This was closed." The fat and rude man raised his shoulders again, and addressed a group of workers to give orders and forget the presence of that old lady. Donna Berta saw herself alone, completely alone before the shapeless mass of confused, sad spots that lay at her feet. "And my son is there. It's that, some of that gray, black, white, red, blue, all mixed together, that looks like a scab." He looked everywhere as if asking for help. "Oh, that's clear. Because of my pretty face, they don't have to nail it back to the wall. It doesn't even have a frame." Four men in blouses, without noticing the old woman, approached the canvas, and with words that Donna Berta could not understand, they began to try to find the best way to lift the painting and take it to a more comfortable place to pack it. The poor 70-year-old looked at them stunned, wanting to guess their purpose. When two of the waiters bent to grab the cloth, Donna Berta screamed. "By God, gentlemen! Wait a minute," he exclaimed, grabbing onto the blouse of a fair-haired young man with a cheerful face. "One moment. I want to see him. One moment. Who knows if I will see him again in front of me." The four young men looked at the old woman in astonishment, and burst out laughing. "She must be crazy," said one. Then Donna Berta, who didn't cry often, despite so many reasons, felt, as a consolation, 2 tears come to her eyes. They slipped clear, lonely, solemn, down her lean cheeks. The workers saw them run, and stopped laughing. She must not have been crazy. It would be something else. The smiling blonde made her understand that they weren't in charge there, that the painting couldn't be seen any longer, because he was moving house. They were taking it to its owner, a very rich American gentleman who had bought it. Yes, I know, that's why. I have to see that figure in the middle, the captain. Yes, that's it, the captain. My God. I have come from my town, from my house, nothing more than for this, to see the captain, and if they take him away, who is to say that I will be able to enter the palace of that gentleman? And while I entreat to be let in, who knows if the painting will be taken to America? The workers ended up shrugging their shoulders, like the fat man, who had disappeared from the room. Listen, said Donna Berta, wait, for charity. This stepladder here can help me. Yes, if you bring it a little closer to me. I don't have the strength, if they bring it to me here, in front of the painting, on this side, I will be able to go up 3, 4, 5 crossbars, holding on well. Well, I can. And from above you will see something. You are going to kill yourself, grandmother. No, sir, they're in the orchard. I would climb like this to pick fruit and hang the linen. I won't fall, no. For charity. Help me. From up there, turning your head, you must see something. For charity. Help me. The fair-haired boy took pity, the others don't. Impatient, they reached for the cloth, while their companion hurriedly brought the ladder closer, and while he held her by one side so that she would not move, he gave his hand to Donna Berta, who, hasty and trembling, climbed with great difficulty one by one those worn and slippery rungs. He climbed 5, grabbed the wood with all the strength he had, and, bending his neck, contemplated the famous canvas, which moved, because the workers. They had begun to raise it. Like an undulating phantom, like a dream, she saw among the smoke, blood, stones, earth, colors of uniforms, a figure that looked at her for an instant with eyes of sublime fear, of heroic terror, the figure of her captain, the one she had found, also stained with blood, at Posidorio's door. Yes, it was her captain, mixed with herself, with her older brother. He was a rondallego grafted onto the husband of his soul, it was his son. But he passed like lightning, moving in a zissas, supine as if he were being carried to bury. He went with open arms, a sword in hand, between crumbling stones and sand, between corpses and bayonets. Couldn't fix the image, he had scarcely seen more than that figure that suddenly filled his soul, so pale, undulating, vanished among other spots and figures. But the expression of that face, the magical virtue of that look, were fixed, they remained in the brain. And at the same time that the painting disappeared, carried by the workers, Donna Berta's vision blurred, she lost consciousness, collapsed and came to fall, slipping down the stairs, into the arms of the compassionate young man who had helped her in his painful ascent. This too was a painting, it seemed in its way, a descent. Chapter 10. In the same car that she had taken for hours, and which was waiting for her at the door, Mrs. Berta was taken to her house, who came to her senses very soon, although she barely had the strength to walk. 2 more days in bed. Then the nervous, feverish, revived activity, new investigations, plus sniffing out recommendations to find out where the owner of her captain lived and to be admitted into his house, to be able to contemplate the painting, and address the great question, that of the purchase. Donna Berta did not speak to anyone, not even to those who helped her look for recommendation cards, about her enormous pretensions to acquire that masterpiece. She was afraid that the inn would find out that she was rich enough to give thousands of duros for a piece of cloth, and she was afraid that her money, which she always carried with her, would be stolen. He had never given in to the advice to put it in a bank, to deposit it. He didn't understand that. They could rip her off. The safest thing was his own fingernails. Sewn the bills to the clothes, to the corset, it was the best. Isolated from the world, despite running through the most central streets of Madrid, due to her deafness and her habits, which did not include learning news from the newspapers, she did not read them, nor did she believe in them. She was still unaware of a sad event, which was to have a decisive influence on his own affairs. He did not know until he finally managed to penetrate the palace of his rival, the owner of the painting. He was a gentleman about his age, healthy, strong, affable, who tried to make himself forgiven for his wealth by distributing benefits. He helped misfortune, but without understanding it. He did not feel the pain of others, he relieved it. By logic he came to heal the ravages of misery, not by revelations of his heart, completely occupied with his own happiness. Dona Berta was amused. He was of the opinion, like those boys in the painting hut, that she was crazy. But his madness was funny, harmless, interesting. "Imagine yourselves," he said in his gathering of banking and political notables. "Imagine you want to buy me the last painting of Valencia." Unanimous laughter always responded to these words. The last painting of Valencia had been wrested from that American hero by dint of money and diplomatic intrigues from the government itself. They had come even recommendations from abroad, so that the poor devil of the Minister of Public Works had to give in, recognizing the priority of money. In addition, justice, charity, were on the side of the Führer. The heirs of Valencia, who were the hospitals, according to his will, would gain much more if the American kept the artistic jewel. Since the government had not been able to exceed the amount set as the price for the painting during the painter's life, and the ultramarine rich man paid his fair price in consideration of being a posthumous sale. The amount to be delivered had tripled due to the accident of the death of the author of the painting that autumn, there in Asturias, in a dark port town, as a result of a cold, a great deal of wetness. In the preference given to the richest there had been some legal irregularity, but strictly speaking, what was fair was for the person who had given the most for it to take the painting. Dona Berta did not know this the first days she visited the private museum of the American. It took her a while to meet and speak to the millionaire, who had let her into his palace on a recommendation, without even knowing who he was or what he wanted. The footmen let the old woman pass, who cleaned her shoes very well before stepping on those rugs, distributed smiles and tips and stayed as if at mass, collected, absorbed, always contemplating the same canvas, the one with the lawsuit, as they called it in home. The painting, placed in its golden frame, fixed on the wall, in that luxurious room, among many other marvels of art, seemed different to Dona Berta. Now she watched him at her pleasure. I read in the features and in the attitude of the hero who died on that bloody and glorious pile of earth and corpses, in a halo of fire and smoke. He read everything the painter had wanted to express, but he didn't always recognize his son. According to the lights, according to his own state of mind, according to how he had eaten and drunk, he guessed or not in that captain in the famous painting his and his captain's son. The first time he felt his faith waver, when he felt doubt, he shuddered, and an icy sweat like death ran down his spine. If she lost that intimate conviction that the captain of the painting was her son, what would become of her? How to give up all his fortune, how to sink into misery to acquire a piece of canvas that he did not know if it was the shroud of his son's image or not? How could he then devote himself to looking for the creditor or his family to pay them the debt of that hero, if it wasn't his son? And to doubt, to fear being deceived, he had given over to greed and usury his Posidorio, his green aran. In order to doubt and fear, she had consented to come to Madrid, to to throw herself into the hell of the streets, into the daily battle of carriages, horses, and passers-by. He repeated his visits to the American's palace, as often as they allowed him. There was a day to go to his post, in front of the painting, morning and afternoon. Tipping encouraged the tolerance of servants. As soon as he left there, the longing to return turned into a fever. When she was in doubt, it was when she most wanted to return to her contemplation, to strengthen her belief, plunging herself into that face, into those eyes like an ecstasy, from whom she wanted to wrest the revelation of her secret. Was he or was he not his son? Yes, yes, said the soul sometimes. But, ungrateful mother, do you even now recognize me? Those parted lips seemed to scream. And other times the lips were silent and the soul of Dona Berta said, who knows, who knows? The resemblance can be coincidence and apprehension. What if I'm crazy? Can't I at least be doggy? But what about having something from my captain and something from me, from all the Rondaligos? It's him, it's not him. He remembered the saints, of the mystical saints, who also used to be tempted by the devil, whom the Lord forgot from time to time, to test them, leaving them in the aridity of a spiritual desert. And the saints won, and even darkened, cloudy the sun of their spirit, they believed and loved, they prayed in the absence of the Lord, so that he would return. Dona Berta ended up feeling the sublime and austere joy of faith in doubt. Sacrificing oneself for the obvious, what a glory! What a triumph! The courage was in giving everything, not because of his faith, but because of his doubt. In doubt, she loved what she had of faith, as mothers love their child more and more when he is sick or when sin steals him away. Weak, sick faith became greater in his eyes than blind, robust faith. Since he felt like this, his resolution to move heaven and earth to make the painting his own was firmer than ever. And he was in this state of mind when he met the rich American for the first time in the hall of his museum. The first day he did not dare to tell him of his unheard-of claim. Not even to ask him the price of the famous painting. At the second interview, requested by her, he solemnly spoke to her of his idea, of his infinite desire to possess too that canvas. She knew how much the state was going to give for him, long ago. His wealth reached such a sum, and there were still thousands of pesetas left over to pay his son's debt, if the creditors appeared. Dona Berta eagerly awaited the millionaire's response, without paying attention to the astonishment that he showed, and that she had already foreseen. It was then that he found out why the painter friend had not answered the letter that he had been sent by one of his own. He learned that his son's companion, the famous and friendly artist who had changed the life of the last Rondallego at the end of his career, that apparition of the forest, had died there on earth, in one of those excursions of his in search of lessons from nature. And the painting of his captain, because of that death, was now worth so many thousands of duros, that all of Susakasa, even if it were 3 times larger, would not be enough to pay for those few yards of cloth. The poor old woman wept, leaning on the shoulder of the ultramarine Fuker, who was very flat, and knew how to have all the appearances of charitable men. The good lady was mad, without a doubt, but for that reason his pain was less true, and the adventure less interesting. He was very kind to the grandmother, he tried to deceive her like children, everything except, of course, letting go of the painting, not for what she could offer him, but for what it was worth. It would be good. What would the government say? Furthermore, even supposing that the good woman had the capital she offered, to accede to her pleas was to lose her, to ruin her, case of prodigality, of madness. Impossible. Dona Berta cried a lot, begged a lot, and came to understand that the owner of her only asset was patient enough to put up with her, even though he did not have enough heart to soften. However, she hoped that God would help her with a miracle. He promised himself to draw water from that rock, tenderness from that boulder that the millionaire carried on his chest. So, for the time being, she was content with letting her go and look at it every day as long as the painting was not transferred to America, and from time to time he would also have to tolerate her seeing him, the rich man, and talking to him and begging him on his knees. The man agreed to everything, sure he would not be defeated, of course, because it was absurd. And Dona Berta came and went, traversing the dangers of the wheels of the carriages and the hooves of the horses, increasingly stunned, weaker, and more determined in her impossible. She was already famous, and for being reputed crazy in the circle of the Americans' friends, and well known to the regular passers-by on certain streets. Half of Madrid had in the head the image of that smiling, vivacious, yellowish old woman, dressed in tobacco color, with a very outdated fashion dress, who fled from the buses, who took refuge in the doorways, and spoke affectionately and with 1,000 gestures to the crowd that did not stop to hear it. One afternoon, when the woman from Rondalliego learned that the man from Havana was leaving and taking her museum, pale as ever, without crying, barely, with a firm voice at first, she asked her executioner for the last conference, and alone, in front of her son, mute witness, dead, she told him her secret, that secret that was around the world in the letter. Lost to the deceased painter. Not for those. The owner of the painting neither softened or believed this new madness. Admitting that it was not all pure fable, pure invention of the crazy, supposing that, indeed, that lady had had a natural son, how could she be sure that said son was the original of the supposed portrait in the painting? All that Dona Berta could get was to be allowed to attend the solemn and sad act of taking down the painting and packing it for the long journey. She was allowed to go and say goodbye forever to her captain, to her presumed son. Something else offered the millionaire: keep the secret, of course, but without prejudice to initiating inquiries to identify the original of that figure, assuming that what the old woman was referring to was not pure fable. And Dona Berta said goodbye until the next day, the last, relatively calm, not because she was resigned, but because she still hoped to win. No doubt God wanted to test her a lot, and he reserved the miracle for the last moment. Oh, but there would be a miracle. Chapter 11. And that night Dona Berta dreamed that from a remote town, there in the ports of her land, where the painter friend had died, a notary, small, very small, almost dwarf, would arrive as if by magic, on the wings of the wind. He had the voice of a cicada and shouted, waving a yellowish piece of paper in his hand, "Hey, gentlemen, stop, here is the last testament, the true one, the other is not valid, the painting of Dona Berta is not left by the author to the hospitals. He gives it as a gift, naturally, to the mother of his captain, of his friend. If you collect the money, Mr. American, the one with the millions, and bring the painting, pass to its legitimate owner Mrs. Berta Rondalliego." He woke up early, remembered the dream and got in a bad mood, because that solution, which would have been very appropriate to perform the miracle he expected the day before, had to be discarded. Oh! She knew too much, from all the sad experience of her life, that dreams do not come true. She went out to the dining room to ask for the chocolate, and there she found an annoying incident, which was annoying above all, because by making her irritated, it took away that anointing that she needed to go and give the last attack to the inveterate Croesus and see if there was a miracle. It was that the boarder, Mrs. Petronila, put on the mat of the dining room table, the eternal question, the only one that divided those two peaceful women, the question of the cat. He couldn't suffer, he had already told him, it seemed wild, with his pampering of the only cat of two old women, with his habits of a peasant animal, independent, stubborn, unruly and sullen, wild, in short, he couldn't stand it. Since there was no garden where she could go out, she dirtied the whole house, including the living room. He broke glasses and plates, tore chairs, curtains, rugs, dresses, he ate the sweets and the meat. A measure had to be taken. Either the cat and its mistress would leave the house, or the latter would agree to a perpetual seclusion of the little animal in a safe place, where it could not escape. Dona Berta argued, defended the freedom of her best friend, but finally gave in, because she did not want domestic complications on such a solemn day for her. Saballona's cat was locked in the attic, in a storage room, a safe prison, because the ironwork of the skylight had a wire mesh. Since no one lived nearby, the prisoner's screams could not interrupt the sleep of the neighbors. No one would hear him, even if he turned into a tiger to vociferate his right to the open air. Dona Berta left her in, sad, downcast, disgusted, and upset with the incident with the cat and the memory of the dream, which would have been so good for reality. It was a holiday, the circulation at such hours produced fright in the spirit of the rondallego. The floor was slippery, dry and frost-polished. It was early, had to make time. He entered the church, heard 2 masses, then he went to a store to buy a collar for the cat, with the intention of embroidering some initials on it, in case it got lost, so that it could be recognized. Finally, the time came. It was in the Carrera de San Geronimo, crossed the street, by dint of politeness and discreet, fearful nudges, he made his way through the crowd that was occupying the entrance to the Imperial. The serious trance arrived, that of crossing Alcala Street. It took him a quarter of an hour to make up his mind. She took advantage of a clear one, as she said, and, raising her dress a little, she began to run, and without incident, among the crowd that swallowed her like a wave, she arrived at Calle de la Montera, and went up slowly, because he was getting tired. She felt more tired than ever. It was weakness perhaps, the chocolate had choked on him because of the cat's fight. He crossed the network of San Luis, thinking, I should have crossed below, where the street is narrower. He entered Calle de Fuencarral, which was one of the most feared. There the rails 3 of the tram looked like razor blades flush with their flesh, they were so glued to the sidewalk. As she passed in front of an old mansion at the beginning of the street, she forgot for a moment, contrary to her habit, about the danger and her care so as not to be run over, and he thought, that's where I think Mr. Canovas lives. He could do the miracle for me. Give me a royal order. I don't know, in short, a voucher so that the American gentleman would have to sell me the painting by force. They say that this Don Antonio commands so much. My God, commanding a lot should have been used for this, to command the just things that are not in the laws. While meditating like this, he had taken a few steps without feeling where he was going. At that moment, she heard a confused noise like voices, saw hands reaching out to her, felt a blow on her back, that her dress was stepped on. The tram, she thought. It was late. Yes, it was the tram. A horse knocked her down, stepped on her, a will passed through his body. The vehicle stopped before leaving its victim behind. It had to be carefully removed from between the wheels. It already seemed dead. It didn't take 10 minutes for him to really be. He didn't speak, or sigh, or anything. It was deposited on the sidewalk for a few minutes, until the authority arrived. The crowd, in a circle, contemplated the corpse. Some recognized the grandmother who came and went so much and who smiled at everyone. A journalist, young and smiling, lively, was suddenly sad, remembering, and he told the contest, that poor old woman had freed him from a fuck like that on Calle Mayor, next to the councils. The corpse was not disgusting or horrifying. Dona Berta seemed asleep, because when she slept she seemed dead. The face is yellowish ivory, hair, ash, in waves, the rest, boots included, all tobacco. There was nothing more than a red stain, a trickle of blood that came out of the corner of the narrow white lips. In the public there was more sympathy than pity. One way or another, this puny little woman couldn't last long, it had to break down soon. In a few minutes the trace of that pain was erased, traffic was restored, the body disappeared, the tram disappeared, and the accident went from the street to the court and to the newspapers. Thus ended the last Rondallego, Dona Berta la de Posadorio. On the street of Tetuan, in a corner of a storage room, in an attic, there was a cat, who had no other name, who had been happy in Susakasa, hunter of peasant mice, great botanist, friend of butterflies and gnats. Asleep in the shade of secular trees. Forgotten by the whole world, its mistress dead, the cat lived many days throwing itself against the walls, and at the end it perished like an ugolino, but without even a bad bone to gnaw, feeling the mice in the solitudes of the nearby attics, but without being able to alleviate hunger with a single prey. First, furious, raging, he hissed, jumped, scratched and bit doors and walls and the iron of the gate. Then, with the ultimate resignation of supreme weakness, he dropped into a corner, and he died perhaps dreaming of the butterflies that he could not catch, but that brightened his days, there in the Aran, flowery in April, with fresh grass and delightful shade on its edges, on the bank of the stream that the lords of the river called his home.